Welcome to Prose Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Hello, and welcome to folks in internet land. This is Prose and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast. We're going to discuss a little bit today about perspective. So the different perspectives writers can take in terms of putting forward a story, how that's going to affect the how the plot is presented, and the different elements of that. So that's going to be very exciting. I will introduce our major players. We have Ali Burnham.
Hello.
Cool. We have Paddy Boylan.
How do you do?
We have Phoenix Ray.
Hello.
And we have James. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten your last name, James.
Healy. And hello, James Healy.
Perfect.
I love that as you were talking about perspective, Alex. James, your perspective was like slowly zooming in and out on your camera.
Yeah, I'm not even sure why it's doing that. I think it's just doing it over its own. It's deciding the best angle.
Cool. So, I guess we should probably look at what we're all kind of what we're all working or having a look at, what we're all sort of reading and discovering all that sort of stuff. So I guess I'll start with you, Ali. What have you been looking at recently?
My most recent binge has been Arcane on Netflix. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else here is across it, because I know I'm kind of late to it. Like, it exploded, I think around Christmas time. The whole internet loved it, and I'm like, I don't quite have enough time to watch it yet, but now I'm finally binging it, and it's just beautiful, just stunning. The story's really tight, and it's really impressive that they've been able to do that, because I think the reputation of properties that come from existing IP or are based on a game, usually they're just rushed through the pipeline. They're not always the highest quality, but Arcane is slick. It's visually beautiful. The story's amazing, and I highly recommend it.
I like the fact that on the Netflix thing there, they've got in the little tags there, it says both gritty and slick, and I'm like, I can't argue with that, because the animation is amazing, and it is, but also it does it's
a gritty world and there's gritty themes, but it looks beautiful.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now. It says it's a League of Legends intellectual property.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. The great cashing in.
But it hasn't slowed them down. I was just discussing with my housemate as we're watching it together. They really resisted the urge in episode 1 to show all the characters with their iconic weapons. I feel like the default is to maybe do a flash forward and be like, here's all the characters at full strength. That you're gonna get what you've come for, like the existing audience. You're gonna see these awesome fights, but it resisted the urge. Instead, it's like episode 1. Here's the story of two young sisters with living their difficult life in the underground, and that I feel like that was just such a smart and contained, a restrained storytelling decision, to be like, no, we're not even going to tease the awesome fight scenes, we're not going to tease the weapons. You're going to have to sit down and go on this journey with these characters before you earn all that action. And just really brave storytelling, but not cheap. They didn't go for the cheap decision.
It makes me wonder how things like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles started out. Did they just start out mid and suddenly the turtles are fighting, or did they have a slow build to story parody? I don't know.
I'll have to go back and watch the original Ninja Turtles.
Yeah, did they spend a couple of episodes following them as turtles before they actually become ninjas?
They're hatching out of the eggs.
You won't believe the twist in episode 4. It gets crazy.
And suddenly the name makes sense.
Yeah. This nature documentary is whack.
Oh, what about you, Paddy? What have you been looking at?
I mean, I've still been reading Moby Dick, which is great. I talked about that in the last episode I was on. Funnier than you'd expect. Just as opaque as I'd expect in some points. I still have whole pages where I don't really understand what Melville's talking about here. It's so metaphorically dense, which can be very rewarding when you tap into it. Feeling smart is a great feeling, but sometimes just leads you I don't get the metaphor. why is the preacher talking about this? Ali, you're nodding. Do you know the scene with like the
Yeah.
preacher in like the church for sailors?
I might not be up to that one, but I was just nodding
Yeah.
along to this sense that like when you're in it and you're clued into what's happening, you feel really good. You're on the
Yeah.
roller coaster and you're
Yeah.
like, this is amazing and this is genius. And then a couple of pages later, you've fallen out of the ride. And so you're just kind of reading along and you're like, I don't know what's happening. And it is just this constant ebb and flow, funny enough, of feeling like you're in the book and you're loving it and then being incredibly alienated. And that's a bizarre experience.
It is a bizarre experience, yeah. That's what I've been consuming.
Nice. Phoenix?
Mine has been a weird mix lately because my partner and I just moved down from Cairns, so we were driving a lot, camping a lot, and stuff like that. So my media consumption has been a mix of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire that we were reading to each other while the other one was driving.
Oh, that's super cute.
And I've also been looking a lot more into, so I love languages in general. So actually one thing I've been reading about recently is some Native American languages. And I'm using that as it's big inspiration for a new thing I'm writing. I've been reading a lot of different, one professor giving an interview or giving his take on languages dying out and how languages reflect a whole new perspective on the world and stuff. And just consuming a lot of that. I speak a bit of Italian as well and have been practicing Spanish. So I just love how they kind of form a soup in my mind, like all these different ways to describe the same thing.
Speaking of how languages shape the way you think, I was listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about how the ancient Greeks seem to have, they conceived the future as behind them and the past as ahead of them. Whereas we always think the opposite, because you can always see the past and the future is completely something that you can't perceive.
It's the same with pitch as well. They do the same thing with pitch, like high is low and low is high, like physically speaking. But it's both inverted. That's really interesting. That's so strange to conceptualize it that way.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, cool. James, what have you been looking at?
I just watched the adaptation of Stephen King's The Stand, the recent one.
Nice.
Which is actually really good. They change up, like in the book, it's a really linear story, but in the series, they kind of do each episode moving backwards and forwards to kind of follow a different idea, which I think worked much better, given how many different characters they have in it. So I thought that was awesome. I just smashed all like 10 episodes of that, like all at once.
Like it's going to be another series, I assume.
No, I think they just, they just did the whole book in like 10 episodes.
That's a big book.
It's a huge book, and there's like 20 characters. Yeah.
Wow, okay.
So
awesome.
It's pretty good. It's pretty faithful to the book as well.
Very cool. Well, I have been, funnily enough, actually, I've been rereading an essay from one of my favorite authors, basically on omniscience as a perspective, which is a nice little dovetail. I swear that wasn't intentional. Like, so this just happened to fall into it. But I'll explain omniscience for anyone who doesn't understand it. So basically, third-person omniscient is when you are basically at a character's back, you're following them, you're looking over their shoulder, but at the same time, anytime you want, you can kind of step out and just be like, here is my universal take on anything, literally anything I want. Like, so you kind of remove yourself from the character. And what he was saying is that it's a really, really rewarding technique if you know how to do it. I know, Paddy, you write like this a lot, and it's not naturally something I advocate to, but it's something I would really, really like to start looking at. But yeah, you can literally zoom out at any time, but then you can also be with the characters as well and go into their headspace. So it's this really interesting. And what he was saying is that a lot of beginner writers tend to stray away from it because it's, basically it implies a lot of authorial intent or maybe, the knowledge of being able to go through, of knowing a lot about any one subject. So it tends to be something that beginner authors tend to skip, but more mature authors will naturally gravitate to. So I don't know, has anyone sort of experimented with that mode
Yeah. And I think, at least for me, when it works is when I have a strong sense of author's voice. When there's a strong sense of voice, the audience is willing to go along with being told this narrator's tale, almost like you're the storyteller in front of a fire. And when there's not, the criticism that I've had is like, but who's telling us this? Like, why are we getting this weird bird's eye perspective on the world? And what's interesting is I find when I write better with a strong sense of voice, even though the narrator often isn't explained, that question doesn't come up. And I don't know why that is.
I never thought of it like that, but you're right. It is a sense of like an authorial overseer there, that you can sort of be like, hey, this is, like you said, the guy around the campfire, just like telling a story and explaining how it's all going and stuff, which you can kind of easily miss if it's just this sort of sterile, like, I am talking from up here. Like I remember your thing about the about the gods, like it had
the fall of Behemoth. Yeah. That
felt like it had slightly less grounded narrative structure than say the Traitor, which is something that we're sort of going through now. That I can see the difference between those two things. Not that it didn't have it at all, but it's sort of a different kind of vibe, I guess. What about you, Ali? Have you experimented to play around with voices at all?
Yeah, no, that was interesting how you defined it, because it's just a different way that I think about omniscience. I've always thought of omniscient as the voice of God, and that it does need to have a very deliberate voice. Because for me, when you're writing in third person limited, to contrast it, which is where your POV is just the scope of your main character, to the point where your narration is flavored by how they would talk. It's not exact thoughts, but it's almost as if your every sentence needs to sound like something that character might say, because it's their take on the world. It's their opinion on the world. While omniscient is when that narration voice isn't that shared. It's not that flavor text of the character you're following around. And I think it's interesting how you made a bit of a judgment about what amateur writers would write like and more mature writers would write like.
It's like, oh no, am I a beginner?
Because I think I would almost argue that beginners make the mistake of, they are close on a character's shoulder. They give us their thoughts and they will flavor their narration with their thoughts. So a reader will be like, cool, we're in limited third. I know what we're doing. And then suddenly they'll start giving us another character's thoughts or knowledge that character shouldn't have. And that's when you get the accusation of, oh, this is head hopping rather than omniscient.
Yeah, I get that feedback a lot. I feel like I really need to work on my sense of perspective, because the last thing you guys feedbacked of mine, it was like, why are they talking now? Why are we following this person? What? Yeah, it could be very disorienting for the reader.
And I guess it's almost how you enter a scene, because I had to do some navel gazing when I got some beta feedback as well on one of my pieces. So for example, my historical fiction is really tight, limited third. And I got feedback on one scene from someone who was like, oh, I preferred it when it was tight and you didn't have all that narration at the start. And I'm sitting here being like, what narration at the start? I'm like, it's all thoughts. I'm like, it was never my intention for there to be a narrator here. What have they interpreted as narration, not thought processes? And I realized it was the opening of the scene. I went straight into my characters having opinions about what he's looking at and musing about what he'll do next, instead of grounding the scene in perhaps action first before going into that thought process. So they've just taken all these, like this paragraph, as a more external view of God narrating instead of the character musing through these thoughts. So I hope my simple fix was I literally just moved the scene around. I moved the chunks around. I gave it some action first, and then we honed in on thought. And I'm like, hopefully that has solved that. And that's interesting when you say, Paddy, that you've had feedback being like, why are we jumping around? It seems to almost be like how you hold your reader through by the hand through the scene prepares them for, is it omniscient? Is it limited third? And how are we interpreting these paragraphs.
Yeah, it's funny you sort of say that, Ali, about when you dive sort of into the thoughts of characters and things and going like, oh, you know, like this is me, like them extrapolating on just how they're saying something. But I'm writing a scene now in my book where a character sort of takes on the aspects of a greater supernatural being, and in doing that, he has more of a wider perspective, and it's sort of like overtaking him a little bit. So I'm wondering if that's going to come across as like, well, wait, who is talking now? Like, what's going on? Like, and it's very difficult to write like that because the natural urge is just to expound on what you're going and just going like, oh, and he felt like this and you can see this and everything. That's just kind of like, well, is that a bit too much? Is like that going to be confusing to a reader? You know, so yeah, it's an interesting sort of thing going from, it always terrifies me starting in close third and then the idea of, well, I need to get to another character. Do I need to paragraph break here, or can I just, like, what defines head hopping? I guess we were talking about that before. It's just kind of going from one to another. I have noticed one really specific way that works quite well is if you have someone, it's clearly their perspective, maybe they're by himself, or maybe it's just really obviously their perspective. Another character comes along, there's a conversation where they're just sort of talking and the perspective could kind of be shared. Then the first character walks off and you're left with the second character. And that seems to be a very effective and like universally okayed way of being like, okay, now we're going to this character. I don't know. We found that. Phoenix, how's your perspective on perspective?
Yeah. It's I feel like I tend to write myself into a perspective and then find myself wanting to change perspective and needing to figure out the maneuver I need to do in order to justify either panning out or jumping to someone else. But I tend to do a lot of very close first person descriptions. Like I tend to write from inside people's heads where it would be their flow of thought. So they're referring to themselves as I and describing their world around them. So it would be a bit jarring to then like suck the perspective out of them and suddenly you're referring to that person, which, you know, you can, and that'd be kind of cool actually. But like, and it's actually one thing I'm dealing with in the current thing I'm writing is I start the current story as a father, and he has a lot of information that the reader doesn't have. So it doesn't feel like a particularly juicy way to reveal to the reader because it's information the character already has. So I know I want to transition to the son who doesn't have this information. So he would be a great literary tool to deliver the information to the reader. But it's figuring out where is the clean break to where I could shift perspective to where it wouldn't be jarring and the reader wouldn't be like, whoa, what? So it's finding those clever points. To me, it's finding those clever breaks where it makes sense to jump. And
yeah, because it's not obvious.
It could be something cool. Like right now I'm playing with like, I'm probably just going to wait for the chapter break and start chapter 2. Okay, new perspective, same scene. But another one I was playing with was just like car door shuts. Suddenly you're in the other person's head. And it can work, but you just need to be very deliberate with it, I feel. And Paddy, I just want to say, I do admire how you did do sort of a third person omniscient so well in the Trader, because I feel like third person omniscient is something I do struggle with. And I don't know if I want to say struggle, I just don't gravitate towards it. My world perspective, my world building tends to take the shape of like, rather than like a Lakitu camera from Mario 64 who's like floating over everyone with a camera. Instead, it's like everyone has a camera and they just cut to, but it's like meanwhile over here, and like everyone's giving their first person account of the same world.
You know what? I don't know if you guys do this, but when I write, I tend to start with a voice. Like I have a narrator's voice, and often like I just in my mind plagiarize another cool narrator's voice from something else, like be it like an audiobook or a video game or something. And then I write everything according to what that voice would say. And that sort of imaginary narrator character dictates it all. I'm getting the sense that that's not something that every writer does, but that's why I tend to write in third person omniscient.
Do you literally mean like, I don't know, the perspective of Bran in Game of Thrones, or like as in his sort of voice and how he would write, or are you talking about like a like the sound of someone's voice, like, and you're like, okay, I'm hearing it.
The sound of someone's voice. The sound of someone's voice.
I think I do that too.
I wouldn't be surprised. Like, Last the Winter has a very. There is a narrator talking to you in that.
I would definitely do that, where I'd start off with a character. If I'm writing kind of close perspective, then I think this is the character's voice and this is how the character is telling this story. And I would see like omniscience and close perspective the same way Ali would, where you have almost like God's perspective, and God needs to have a very authoritative voice and can view the character any way. He can judge them, he can pity them, he can admire them, but it has to be a very authoritative voice telling the story. Whereas if you go in close perspective, the character like thinks they're right all the time, and then they have a voice about how they can conceptualize things, and maybe they doubt themselves here and there, but they do have a very distinct voice. And every different character, I certainly try to have a very different voice for every different character I write, depending on what their attitude is about what they're doing.
I was going to say, I'm really fascinated by your process, Paddy, because I've tried Omniscient before and I actually found it incredibly paralyzing. I'm like, well, who is telling this story? And maybe I thought about it way too hard. And I'm like, well, if I'm going to understand what this authoritative voice is, I'm like, well, who are they? What are they speaking from? What do they care about? And I went down that rabbit hole way too far that I'm like, well, now I'm not writing.
I think it's a product of what we grew up reading. It's like one of my favorite authors is Kurt Vonnegut Jr. And he writes his books. He's the narrator. He doesn't even mess around with it. He's like, I'm Kurt Vonnegut Jr. I'm going to tell you a story. And he uses his voice.
Yeah.
Well, the only way I could write Cypress is articulating it to myself that this is Will sitting down at the end of his life telling his story in third person.
Cypress has a voice. Cypress definitely has a...
Yeah.
And if you tell me that, I say that it's Will's voice. I'm like, this is the character's voice. And... so like it doesn't feel like me. It's almost like I need that layer of separation and then I can just run with it. But if I think too hard about my voice or the author sitting down to write this and who is this voice, that blocks the words for me.
Yeah. I've actually never conceptualized it like that. Like an actual voice, like, hey, this is this person talking about it, which is probably why I do struggle with Omniscient a little bit. Sorry, Phoenix, were you going to say something?
I was going to say that, like, I feel like I just naturally drop into one based on whatever the inspiration for the story is. Because as we've been talking, I've been thinking, like, when was the last time I used Omniscient Third? And like, because I don't do it very often. And then I remembered I did actually start one piece, Omniscient Third, and I didn't think about it at all. It was just like, and this story is told this way, and it just happened. Like, I was this other outside party talking about the events of what was taking place. And there was no premeditation on that at all. I didn't like think, and then same with the one I'm writing now, it just started in this guy's head. And then I usually find myself just, okay, I guess this is the field I'm working with.
Well, sometimes it just happens like that, right? Like your authorial voice, the voice of a character, if it's first person. I remember reading something about the Hunger Games, the author of that, I forget her name. She was like, I was going to tell it the third person, but I just started writing Katniss, and I was like, no, this is like coming from the mind of a 16-year-old girl, and she just had to do that and write sort of through that. So yeah, I guess it just depends where you're kind of going from it and what you want to get across, really. James, what do you think? Have you had much experience? Well, you've done quite a bit with Omniscient. I feel like mostly Last the Winter, but would you say Fuel was close? I guess that's close third person, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and I almost feel like Cooling Engine started in an Omniscient place and then ended up just kind of honing in and getting very close to the character, which is something I quite like. I kind of like the idea of maybe setting things up in an omniscient voice and then trying to get in as close as you can. I think that kind of perspective shift can be really good in science fiction if you're trying to tell a lot about the world, but then also give it contextualization. An awful lot of science fiction stories tend to place a character in some kind of position where they're kind of almost have their hands in every pie or something like that. They can kind of see every aspect of the world.
Because the author needs to explain all the minutiae of their amazingly detailed world.
Yeah.
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 And this tends to come at a bit of a cost of character, or maybe a bit of cost of
it can.
context.
I'm thinking Isaac Asimov, who, like, his ideas are amazing. His characters are 2D cutouts.
100%.
Just absolute cardboard. Yeah, totally.
Something I really, really liked was how Margaret Atwood wrote Handmaid's Tale, and she wrote it from the perspective of a character who didn't really understand what was going on in a lot of the rest of the world, but it was all based on her experience and her emotions. And I thought that was really, really, really strong and really different for a science fiction kind of story. So that's something that I've always really admired and something that I've tried to do. Another thing on perspective was kind of similar to what Phoenix was talking about, was I was writing a story which was originally past tense, but there was a whole lot of concepts in it that I wanted to like really, really explain to the reader and make sure that they made sense, because they had to in order for the rest of the story to continue and make sense. So I changed it to first person and decided to follow the character's journey as he learned all of these things. And I lost the voice. I lost so much of what made the story interesting. I lost that kind of authoritative way of telling the story. So I'm kind of in a place now where I'm trying to figure out, I probably should tell it past tense, but how much can I have the character be telling the story like he's reliving it for the first time, and then adding in his later attitudes as well. But that's an interesting one with perspective as well, trying to figure out, is it better in past tense or is it better present tense? Because present tense is much better for, I suppose, action and probably making you feel quite close to the character. Whereas I think past tense gives you a little bit of distance. It's like, oh, these things have already happened and I'm kind of following along in this.
It's interesting because with present tense, I think I was talking to Matan, another writer in our group, and he was sort of saying that present tense is so immediate that it can kind of be quite exhausting if you stay in that. So that's why I'll find often a lot of flashbacks and things are in present tense, and other things are sort of, the bulk of the story will be told in past. Has anyone else found that?
I had a crack at present tense first person for a short story because I wanted to simultaneously do two things that were alienating to me at once.
I remember you mentioning that you were going to do that.
I mean, it was quite short. It's around 4K. I kept it short, and for that reason, Alex, it not so much that it was exhausting to write, but it was quite a high octane short story that did feel like it was at 11 the entire time. And I feel like trying to write an entire novel like that. I know it's really common in YA trends. It would be present tense is just really popular. I can't explain why. While it's almost as if the past tense is what we associate with the older books.
I wonder if it's something about the psychology of being a young adult. Like you're so in your own mind and wrapped up and preoccupied with your own actions and thoughts. About I was anyway. Maybe this is just like giving away way too much. But it's a very I feel like there's a lot more self-examination. I wonder if that's got something to do with it.
Off of what you just said, Ali, I once challenged myself to write a first-person present tense horror story. But it's very quick. It's maybe like 100 words. Like it was made to be on Instagram. It's very small. But the challenge that I wanted was, because in a horror movie, you normally have the thing that sets up suspense is that you have the character that's ignorant to what's going on, but the camera that represents the audience can see the environment changing and happening around them, and you see them walking into the danger. How do you set up danger and suspense when you're in the first person who is ignorant to the suspense? And I was like, that's what I want to try to do. And it was a very fun challenge, and I was happy with how it came out. But that was just so fun.
How did you do it?
It was through the establishment of pattern. So creating something for the reader to pick up on that
the character ignores, right?
The character ignores.
I was just thinking that was how you would do it.
Yeah, and it was through sensation. So it was through the sense of touch. And so I set up a sense of pressure by taking the character takes a sleeping pill at the beginning of the story because he's been having trouble sleeping. And throughout the story, that starts taking effect. So you see them losing themselves. And then right at the end, you get the drop of a sensation that they expected is a sensation that was different. And specifically, it's them petting their dog. They mention the dog is bald and furless. And then at the end, they're like, oh, petting my dog. And it's like, oh, so fluffy, so fluffy. And then they're like, wait a minute. And then the story ends with Fluffy question mark, and it's as they're falling asleep.
I was thinking like sound cues or something like that, like a noise from the other room that the character ignores. The audience knows it's significant because why else would it be mentioned?
Yeah.
You could do that too. But it was a fun. I had a lot of fun with that one.
I was reading something. You guys might be familiar with Hugh Howey's Wool, and there's actually a scene exactly like that where the character has been poisoned, and from the perspective of the character, she's like, "Oh, this is fine. Like I'm feeling drowsy. I hope no one like gets mad at me because I've just walked up all these stairs and now I'm weak." And you get the sense that she's sort of doing something. Like, I think she's falling over or something, but it's not really explained. But you get the reactions of the other characters being like, "Oh my God, Johns, are you okay? What's happening?" Get the nurse. But like from her perspective, it's all, "Why are they making a fuss? Like, it's fine. I'm just tired." So it's this very strange disconnect between the character's perspective, the third person sort of thing, and the all the other characters being like, "Oh no, shit's getting fucked up. What's happening?" So that was a sort of fun take on that. How are we doing for time? I think it might be time to look into our sample. James, do you have your sample for us? To not critique, but like listen to.
Oh, we're going to critique it.
Yeah, it's a fair bit to critique in this. I haven't seen it for a while.
If you mess up the POV, we're on it.
Yeah, it's pretty sure it's third person omniscient.
Ooh.
And just in terms of perspective, this was a post-apocalyptic story that was supposed to follow a group of people living in a settlement that leave the settlement and go out into the dangerous world. And because I was having a difficult time economically setting up the characters in the settlement while explaining that the world had collapsed, I decided to put a chapter at the beginning that followed the character who would later be introduced as their guide to the dangerous world outside. So I followed him for a chapter where he was hunting a deer in the woods. And then I kind of revealed that there was all these buildings around him while he was hunting the deer. So he takes out the deer and goes to get his sled so that he can bring the deer to his car. And I'll just start reading then. Haven't seen this in a while, so this might be not the smoothest reading, but we'll fire away all the same. Lifting the sled, Luke trudged out into the grove. To his light surprise, when he dragged the sled back to where the stag had fallen, he was no longer alone. Luke smirked, recognizing the breed. The retriever sojourned its inspection of the stag to raise its snout to him and stare. No domesticated canine ever looked at a human that way. Curiosity was long gone from this animal, replaced by predatory instinct and fear. Its eyes were dark and threatening as rifle barrels. Hunger and malice dripped from its lips as they drew back into a sharp white snarl. Luke met the stare, baring his own teeth. The display transgressed language, stating he was too a predator of the wild and unwilling to give up his meal. The retriever rippled out a growl, flattening its ears. With care, he lowered the sled and reached for his crossbow. Only then did he notice the others. Gleaming eyes lit up within the shadows of foliage like stars at midnight. He counted a dozen hungry dogs surrounding him and the stag. They each were starved, thin-legged with ribs pushed out against stomachs, matted dour coats and lips drawn taut over rows of sharp teeth. With a bitter last look at his kill, Luke surrendered the stag to the pack and began edging away. Useless against this number, he set the crossbow down in the grass. Similarly, he shrugged off his coat as the sleeves and waist were thick with the stag's blood. The pack moved in, materializing from the grove like four-legged phantoms. Dirty coats and lean bony frames, they surrounded the stag, jaws hung open with tongues lolling, drool dripping and eyes bulging with the savagery starvation bred. From behind the retrievers, a large German shepherd stalked, head low, ears flat, eyes wild with dominant fury. This was clearly the alpha. Mammothing the others in size and muscle, she made her way to the front. The others hung back, waiting for her to begin the feast. Luke shrank into the doorway of the house in front of which he'd killed the stag, disappearing into shadow. The dog still watched him, but in an instant he would be forgotten. The shepherd lurched forward, sinking her teeth into the stag and tearing at the soft flesh of its belly. The others bounded in to join the feast. Luke checked the way through the house was clear. The collapsed roof littered the living room beneath a wide sunbeam. Every wall and door was ravaged by rot. Luke braced himself and waited for the entire pack to be preoccupied. Not all of them were joining in, however. The smaller dogs bounded around the edges of the pack, searching for a way through. Anytime they made an effort, the larger dogs would snap and bite, driving them back. It didn't take long for them to turn their attention from the stag and set their hungry eyes on Luke once more. The air left his lungs in a rush. Sweat sprang forth, adding to his appetizing scent. He backed from the advancing dog, sinking into the damp, murky crypt.
Very nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was just my
metaphors-
attempt.
Hmm?
Oh, that was just my attempt to show kind of how long it had been since civilization's been a thing.
There's something that third person omniscient. Would you call that third person omniscient? It seemed like it was. Not super
Yeah, I think so.
omniscient, but
Very subtly, I enjoyed that it could almost be mistaken for limited, except for
Yep.
just the little bit of insight we're able to get about the wolves and
Yep.
the dogs.
That's
You were
what I
just
was-
like he had an appetizing scent, or he would soon be forgotten. You've
Yep.
just given us small little phrases that qualify it as omniscient, that it improves the work that we get what the wolves are thinking.
Yep.
Really adds to it. Yeah.
I was just thinking when you do a more omniscient view, there's a lot more room for poetry and metaphor. Because if it follows a
Definitely, yeah.
person tightly, they're unlikely to be thinking like, "Oh, gee, those wolves remind me of their eyes are like stars at midnight." They'd be too worried about
Yeah.
being eaten.
That's it.
That was a nice metaphor, man. It was something like eyes in the dark, like stars at midnight.
That one and eyes like gun barrels were.
Yeah.
That one got me very good.
Yeah,
That was awesome.
Thank you.
I feel like I do want to defend third person limited a little bit.
yeah,
For the general sense, it's been pushed down this podcast. But I was thinking, like, to counter that, it just depends on what character you're picking. Are they a character who thinks in metaphors and in quirky ways? I'm going to keep coming back to Cypress, just so it's fresh in my mind. But it's a work that gets compliments for how it's constantly comparing, like, personifying boats. And it's a character choice. It's not. The narrator of the world isn't comparing all the boats to people, but this is a character who, for some reason, always feels the need to give the boat his own personality. And so it's simultaneously a character layer, and we're having fun with metaphor, and it's a voice thing.
And he wants to make love to all the boats.
Also a character insight, yes.
And also, look, the third, it really has its place in terms of certainly thriller stuff and horror or anything like that, where you want to be like, look, you only know so much, and that's kind of part of it, just that sense of like, what's going on? I don't know what's happening. Whereas if it were omniscient, all of a sudden it'd be like, oh, the things were going to come and kill them, and like, I suppose you could willfully negate that, but something about that third person, like, boxed in, like, claustrophobia is very effective for that.
I also have an example where it's worked
Certainly.
really well for comedy in that. So I do a really hard scene break from one character to another. We've just come off like a high octane shit's gone down kind of scene from one POV. We now jump to another character he's literally out fishing, and he has no idea of the drama that's happening 100 meters away. And it's just a scene that's 3 pages long about fishing. And that on its own shouldn't be funny,
Yeah.
except for the fact that the audience is aware that happening simultaneously is this scene. This character has no idea what's happening about.
That's
So like the
I
comedy
love that.
is inherent in this POV break decision. So it's a useful tool for that as well.
Yeah, you're right. And that worked really well, actually.
comic relief. Yeah, true enough.
Isn't there a
Fair
term for
enough.
when the character has different knowledge for the audience? Is there a word for that? I feel like there should be.
Isn't
If
that-
there's not,
Dramatic irony.
there you go.
Character
Dramatic
Oh,
irony.
audience. I guess. Yeah, I suppose so. That'd be close. Facetiousness. I don't know. All right. I think we'll wrap it up there. I have produced a quote. Unfortunately, it's not about perspective, but it's just such a great quote that I've been thinking about it like for weeks. So I will read that. It's from George R.R. Martin, of course. I'm sure we've done another
Who's
one
that?
from him. I'm almost certain, but what George R.R.
I don't know.
Anyway, the quote is, "I've always agreed with William Faulkner. He said that the human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. I've always used that as my guiding principle, and the rest is just dressing."
That's
I think
good.
that's really nice. Yeah, it like that's one of those quotes that you think about and go, "Oh, yeah, that is very, very profound." Like you can You can literally base a career on that, and he certainly has. All right, well, I guess we'll call it there unless anyone else has any final thoughts and words. I think this is Pros and Cons signing off. We'll see you later.
See ya.
Yeah.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.